That's fascinating. Still with a history hat on, next year marks a century since the start of the First World War. Not only was there devastating loss of life, but it was a conflict that brought huge change socially and economically.
Well, this summer on Midlands Today, we'll be focusing on the lead-up to the war and life in 1913. Our business correspondent, Pt.1, has been looking back at what turned out to be an era of great change for both living and working conditions across the Midlands.
Metal bashing in Birmingham's jewellery quarter, a process that hasn't changed in over 100 years and something that, according to historians, helped Birmingham gain the title the City of 1,000 Trades.
Anything made out of metal, they made it, and it was often tiny little workshops, no more than a dozen employees, perhaps a couple of apprentices.
But by 1913, things were changing fast.
Under these roofs, 3/4 of a mile in extent, are housed all the basic industries employed in the making of a motor car.
Once one of the world's biggest car factories, Austin at Longbridge set the pace, producing thousands of cars virtually from scratch. 100 years on, and with much of the site now being redeveloped, experts like Tom Donnelly still marvel at what was effectively a new industrial revolution.
What you were getting instead of individual trades, but trades becoming increasingly interlocked into each other because of the industrial structure. The gradual movement towards standardisation, interchangeable parts, hastened by the advent of machine tools.
Rare footage from 1913 showing King George V and his Queen visiting the Royal Doulton factory at Burslem in Stoke-on-Trent. Thanks to visits like this, the potteries had a worldwide reputation for fine china, but things were starting to change. Despite continued support from the royal family, there were still concerns about the long-term future of this site and its workforce. Even in 1913, there were worries about cheap imports from abroad, particularly the Far East, where labour was much cheaper.
I mean, they were turning out stuff just as good as what we were in Stoke-on-Trent. But the fact is it was so cheap, and that was a worrying thing, particularly for places like Royal Doulton and Spode.
Like some jungle growth, Birmingham stretched and spread under the thrust and urge of the Industrial Revolution.
And changes weren't just happening in industry. Living conditions in some areas described as unfit for human habitation were changing too. By 1913, Birmingham's infamous back-to-back houses were being demolished, although many remained even after the war.
And there we have the mangle, which at times was damned hard work, especially when you got blankets.
Anne Lawton used to live in a house like this. She's now a guide at Birmingham's only remaining back-to-backs, now owned by the National Trust.
And the lavatory. We were considered lucky because we shared with just one other family.
Even inside the back-to-backs, things weren't much better, with cramped conditions.
One child up there, one down here. If they're small, you'd have two, and the same in that one.
And then, 4.5 miles from the city centre, we pass through a tunnel and suddenly find ourselves in a setting like this.
By 1913, lives were changing fast and people were moving out of the centre into new suburbs like Bourneville. A model village built around the Cadbury factory. More than 100 years on, the area remains virtually unchanged. And it's not difficult to see why so many people wanted to escape the city. And for people who are lucky enough to move from the back-to-backs into places like Bourneville, they'd have noticed a big change in their lifestyle. In addition to having gardens, the model village built around the factory had a whole host of other facilities, including schools, churches, shops and even a bank. Places like Bourneville set a trend for new suburbs and model villages all over the world, which ultimately, more than 100 years on, has left millions of people with a much better way of life. Peter Plisner, BBC Midlands Today.
Gosh, fascinating stuff. Now it's been a